Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU Audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, Staff Training and Research Institute of Distance Education, STRIDE, Master's Degree Programs, Master of Arts, Distance Education, MADE, Second Year. MDE 417 Distance Education, Economic Perspective. Block 5 Readings in Economics of Distance Education, Collection of Articles, Research Papers. Unit 1, The Economics of Mass Distance Education, Greville Rumble. In Rumble, G. ed. 2004, Papers and Debates on the Economics and Costs of Distance and Online Learning. Oldenburg, Carl von Ossietzky University, reprinted by permission. There is a belief that distance education is cheaper than traditional forms of education. What is usually meant by this is that the cost per student and/or per graduate is less than in traditional forms of education. Since students can progress at different rates, either full-time or part-time, the cost per student is often expressed in some kind of standard measure such as the cost per student hour or cost per full-time student equivalent. It is not always easy to compare the costs of distance and traditional systems. They may have different objectives, they may teach different subjects or the same subjects in very different ways, the previous educational qualifications of the students entering the systems may be different, and this may affect their success in producing graduates. And the quality of the teaching may be different. Any one of these variables may affect costs and the way we view them. Generally, however, cost comparisons are confined to institutions teaching at the same level, primary, secondary or tertiary, and the assumption is made that the quality of education offered is similar. Of course, distance education systems are not set up just because they are believed to be cheaper. However, cost is an important factor, and those responsible for their establishment rightly point out that they can be cheaper. The organizing committee of the Venezuelan Universidad Nacional Abierta stated its belief that the institution would contribute in significantly reducing the annual cost per student and the social cost per graduate, COUNA, 1979. The Andhra Pradesh Committee on the Establishment of an Open University, 1982, cited evidence drawn from early cost studies of the British Open University to the effect that the average recurrent and capital cost per student in the latter was less than that found in conventional British universities, and implies that the foundation of a distance teaching university in Andhra Pradesh would be cheaper than any alternative course of action open to the state government. Unfortunately, the hopes of politicians and planners are not always realized. There are examples of distance teaching schemes where the cost per student or cost per graduate, and sometimes both, have been higher than costs in traditional systems doing comparable tasks, just as there are plenty of examples of distance teaching systems which have been cheaper. Perto. 1982. The cost structures of distance and traditional education are so different that those setting up distance systems experience considerable difficulty in describing the operation and economics of their institution to officials in government and funding agencies. Snowden and Daniel, 1980. To understand why this is so, and why distance systems may be both cheaper and more expensive than traditional ones, it is necessary to have some knowledge of the way educational costs behave. The basic cost function. The total costs of an enterprise are made up of both fixed and variable costs. Fixed costs do not vary continuously in relation to changes in volume of activities, although they may change if activities are ended or if there are very significant changes in volumes. What is a significant change in volume needs to be defined within the context of the enterprise. Variable costs tend to increase or decrease directly, linearly, with fluctuations in the value of activity. The basic cost function for any educational system is T equals SQC8PLF, where T is the total cost, S is the number of students, C is the number of courses which are being developed, P is the number of courses being presented to students, F is fixed cost of the system, administrative costs and other overheads, 2 is the direct cost per student. And the total direct cost of courses in presentation is P. The variables for which volumes of activity are identified here as being of significance are S, C and P. There may be others which are of importance in particular distance education systems, for example, the number of local study centers at which teaching takes place. However, the model used in this article ignores the influence of other variables. All the costs on the right-hand side of the equation are dependent on management choice. In distance education systems, student-related costs include the costs of materials supplied to students, the costs of distributing materials where these are sent to each student, the costs of paying tutors to mark students' assignments and examination scripts, and the costs of any face-to-face tuition. Obviously, the cost per student goes up if one gives students more rather than less material, while the cost per student of tuition, for example, will vary depending on the amount of tuition given and the student-tutor ratio. The direct costs of developing a course will include labor costs, payments to authors, editors, designers, broadcast producers, as well as the development and production costs of producing master copies or prototypes of course materials, for example, payments of consultants, payment for rights, cost of editing broadcasts and preparing master tapes, etc., where cost behaves can be changed by management decision. The cost of producing copies of the materials which are given to the students is a direct student cost, while the cost of producing a stock of materials which one lends to students while they are registered on a particular course is a direct course cost. For example, if one gives students the video cassettes associated with the course, the cost of this copy is a direct cost which is incurred for each student, then the cost of the stock of copies is a direct cost of the course. The direct course-related costs of presenting a course include such items of expenditure as the cost of transmitting broadcast associated with the course, rewriting examination questions, monitoring the course, and generally updating and clarifying the materials. Overhead costs are more or less self-evident, covering the costs of management functions, personnel, finance, management services, administration, institutional planning and evaluation, etc. The more sophisticated the management and control system, the greater these costs are likely to be. Overhead costs may also include an allowance for the replacement of capital, studio and transmission equipment, computers, etc., all of which will in due course wear out and need to be replaced. There are a number of ways of treating capital costs, but for practical purposes what is really important is the cost to the enterprise of replacing the capital item when it is worn out with a new item which will fulfill a similar function. The use of media and the problems of managing distance taught students means that the overhead costs of the institution, f, the costs of developing a course, 8, and the course-related costs of presenting courses, 1. are in general higher in distance teaching institutions than in traditional institutions with comparable student numbers. However, the relatively limited amount of support given to student means that the direct cost per student, too, is lower. This is because much of the managerial and academic effort of the institution is being put into the development and maintenance of educational material and administrative systems for the control of distance students. This then represents a form of capital investment which replaces direct student-teacher contact, and which can be used to teach many times numbers of students that can be catered for in such traditional forms of education as the face-to-face, lecture, seminar and tutorial. In essence, capital replace labor, offering to educationists what Wagner, 1982, described as a mass production alternative to the traditional craft approach. The extent to which fixed, capital, costs can predominate in distance education was shown in a comparative study of the costs of course at conventional British universities and at the distance teaching Open University. Whereas the ratio of variable to fixed course costs at conventional British universities was about 1:8, at the Open University it was about 1:2000, Laidlaw and Laird, 1974. The costs of developing, producing and distributing course materials. A particular feature of distance education systems is the level of investment required in the system before a single student can be enrolled. The investment in capital items, buildings, equipment, etc., can be considerable, particularly if studio-based technologies and satellite or terrestrial broadcasting are used. And these facilities have to be built, as opposed to being hired as required. Use of computer-based technologies for teaching and administration also adds significantly to cost. Provision needs to be made for the warehousing and handling of course materials, so warehouses may have to be built and will certainly need to be equipped to meet the institution's needs. Additional costs will be incurred if it is decided to set up an in-house print shop rather than use existing commercial printers. A range of course materials sufficient to meet the academic objectives of the institution and provide potential students with an element of choice has to be designed and produced. The most significant cost here is likely to be the cost of the academic and related staff required to develop the materials. Sparks, 1984, has suggested that whereas it takes from 1 to 10 hours of staff time to develop 1 hour of small group teaching, and from 2 to 10 hours to prepare a 1-hour lecture, it will take from 3 to 10 hours to prepare 1 hour of tutored video instruction, TVI. 50 to 100 hours to prepare a teaching text which will occupy a student for 1 hour, 100 hours or more to develop a broadcast quality, 60-minute television program, 200 hours or more to prepare 1 hour's worth of computer-aided learning, and 300 hours or more to prepare 1 hour's worth of material on interactive video disc. These figures need to be treated with some care. Broadly speaking, there are 4 approaches to the creation of distance learning materials. The first of these is to look around for some existing material which can be used either as it stands or in adapted form to meet the needs of distance taught students. It is quite common, for example, for an institution to recommend certain textbooks to its students, which they are then required to buy in order to take the course. Obviously, this vastly reduces the costs of the institution, which then only has to prepare a few notes of guidance and some assessment questions in order to begin teaching. This approach involves hardly any creative effort on the part of the teaching institution, and is a very cheap way of proceeding. It is used by some commercial correspondence colleges preparing students for professional and other examinations. It rarely produces good self-instructional teaching materials, but it does allow a wide range of course to be developed at very little cost. It is also used in a modified form in some high-level open university courses, where the amount of self-instructional materials produced to support student learning is limited. The second approach is to tack the distance teaching system onto a conventional teaching system by video recording lectures given to conventional student and preparing lecture notes to accompany the videos. The lecture notes can be reproduced, in modified form, lecture handouts, examples written up on blog boards, flip charts or overhead projector acetates, photographic slide, etc. Once lecture theatres have been equipped with video cameras and recording equipment, the additional per capita costs of preparing videos and lecture notes for use by off-campus students can be very little, as Wagner, 1975, showed in respect of the off-campus graduate engineering program at Colorado State University. And Lesile, 1979, demonstrated in respect of the University of Waterloo correspondence program. A vast library of video material can be built up rapidly for relatively little total cost. While the quality of these videos may not be very high, they are adequate for their purpose. Broadcast by satellite, they can enable students spread over very wide geographical areas to listen into lectures providing up-to-date information on technological advances. Students may also be able to participate in the lectures through telephone links, tutored video instructions, or TVI. Such approaches are now being used by a number of universities including the National Technological University in the United States. Both the third and fourth approaches are based on the development of special self-instructional materials, print, audiovisual, broadcast etc., designed to teach distance students. There is little doubt that the quality of specially designed and produced distance teaching materials can be very high indeed. The third approach is to plan the curriculum and to specify course content in broad outline, and then appoint academic consultants to develop the written materials and script for broadcast and audiovisual materials. This kind of approach was adopted by the Universidad Estatal a Distancia in Costa Rica. It has the great advantage that payment is by results. The academics are not permanent members of full-time staff, so there is no long-term commitment to train them, provide them with time to undertake research, deal with staff problems arising from low productivity or obsolescence of knowledge relative to institutional needs, etc. Curriculum planners specify the aims, objectives and broad content of new programs of study, and academic editors and educational technologies turn the consultants' drafts into finished products. If the authors fail to deliver the goods, they do not get paid. Advance notification of a course may be given, but sometimes, as at the Open Learning Institute in British Columbia, a course is only announced after all the materials have been handed over for production. The process has more in common with a publishing house than a university. Commercial correspondence colleges which create their own materials use consultants because this is obviously a relatively cheap and flexible way of employing academic course writers and broadcast and audiovisual producers. The cost of employing an author on contract can nevertheless vary, depending on supply. In some countries or in some subject areas suitable authors can be hard to find and they may command high fees. The fourth approach is to employ a core of full-time academic staff to create the course materials. Such staff may be appointed on permanent or temporary contracts. Where the appointments are permanent, the staff needs to keep themselves abreast with their subject areas, hence they need time off for study and possible research. After a time, permanent staff may acquire many of the skills of instructional designers and educational technologies. Unlike temporary staff, they are not always looking towards the next job, but bad appointments may become a long-term liability, particularly in systems where there is tenure. The total salary bill also depends on how the academic staff is deployed. Institutions such as the Open University, Athabasca University in Canada, and Deakin University in Australia, which have adopted a course team approach, in which groups of academic and technical staff work together on a project team to develop a course, need higher levels of staffing than those that require the staff merely to stick to their own specialist task. On the other hand, while the course team approach is expensive in staff time and hence pushes costs up, it does enable staff to work in a very creative environment. Of these four approaches, the first is the cheapest and the last the most expensive. A further factor to be taken into account in considering the cost of the course development, production and presentation system is the choice of media. Here again, management choice can greatly influence the cost of the system. We have already noted Sparks's contention that the time required to develop material designed to serve 1 hour of student learning varies significantly depending on the choice of media. The costs of developing their material are, however, not the only costs. Printed materials needs to be designed, edited, typeset, printed and distributed. Video and audio material has to be disseminated through appropriate channels and received on appropriate equipment. Computer-based systems require extensive equipment and access to networks, as well as a great deal of investment in software. To take the case of print, all material will require editing and design work. The cost of editing an author's manuscript into a form suitable for a self-instructional learning package is likely to be greater if contract authors are used. The cost of design can vary significantly, depending on the extent to which illustrations and artwork is incorporated into the text. The way the text is set affects costs. Offset lithography from typed originals is generally cheaper than letterpress printing from hot metal type. Use of word processors instead of typewriters makes the preparation of camera-ready copy even easier, and can affect authoring costs. Timmers, 1986, reckoned that the use of word processors at the Vancouver-based Open Learning Institute cut the time taken to develop and prepare for production a page of text from 1 hours to 50. On the other hand, where texts have to be handwritten, costs can escalate. The Allama Iqbal Open University pays its calligraphers on the same scale as university lectures. Some institutions, such as the Sri Lanka Open University, prepare their text in more than one language, thus incurring the costs of translation. The costs of printing can also vary. Paper costs differ from country to country, different grades of paper may be used, and the costs of printing change depending on the method used. The costs of the offset litho process are affected by whether paper or metal plates are used. The former are cheaper but are good for only about 500 copies. The use of color adds greatly to the costs of printing. Variations in distribution costs can be so significant that it is difficult to make generalizations, but obviously it depends on whether the materials are mailed direct to individual students' homes, as happens at the British Open University, or are dispatched to local centers for collection by students, as happens at the Universidad Estatal a Distancia in Costa Rica. Finally, printing costs are susceptible to economies of scale. The length of the print run makes a great deal of difference to the unit cost per title. On the other hand, where more than 1 year's stock is printed, the costs of storage will also need to be taken into account. The production costs of video vary enormously too. The cost per hour of videotaped lectures is much less than broadcast quality television. The latter is expensive for a number of reasons. The cost of equipment to produce broadcast quality television is greater than that required to produce video. Broadcasting unions in some countries have pushed the rates of pay to very high levels, and in many cases this has been coupled with agreements on staffing levels which have also exacerbated costs. What constitutes broadcast quality television is also subject to different standards. In the United States, the Public Broadcasting Service broadcasts 3/4-inch low-band U-matic tape-generated material, which is cheaper to produce than the 3/4-inch high-band tape material used by the television companies in the United Kingdom. It is perfectly feasible to produce broadcastable, educational material at low cost. The National Technological University, for example, broadcast low-cost videotype lectures by satellite which is perfectly adequate for its purpose. The distribution costs of video can also vary significantly, depending on whether video cassettes or terrestrial or satellite-based systems are used, the latter encompassing both direct broadcasting by satellite, DBS, and satellite to cable head ends, and the extent to which the distance education institution is responsible for meeting the capital costs of the distribution system or has access to transmission time at economic or marginal costs. In general, television is an expensive medium and cannot be justified in circumstances where the basic infrastructure to support it, maintenance services and trained manpower, is lacking or a significant proportion of homes are not equipped with television sets. Aicha et al., 1982. The costs of home-based video systems, in which individual students are expected to equip themselves with video players and either record off-air or play cassettes which have been provided by the teaching institution on loan or for purchase, can also be significant. The Open University found that it was cheaper to give each student a 60-minute video cassette than transmit over the air, provided that there were fewer than 133 students on the course. Between 234 and 233 students, it was cheaper to loan a cassette to each student, paying the costs of postage each way. Over this level, it was cheaper to transmit once using the national television channels of the BBC. These crossover points were obtained using cost-volume charts and, of course, be installed in local centers with students accessing cassettes from a library of tapes held at the center. The overall costs of such a system will be lower, but there are drawbacks, not least, the needs for the institution to maintain the equipment, ensure its safekeeping, and provide sufficient players in quiet rooms so that students do not have to wait too long to view the cassette of their choice, and for students to travel to the center at times when it is open. Radio and audio cassettes have the advantage that they are relatively cheap, and audio cassettes can be used in imaginative ways with printed material to provide an audiovisual element. Aicha et al. 1982 were nevertheless skeptical about the cost efficiency of ratio in systems with under 2,000 students, while the Open University found that for courses with under 1,000 students, it was cheaper to provide audio cassettes to each student rather than transmit radio programs over the air. The comments on the use of cassettes versus over-the-air transmission relate to costs and not to the educational effectiveness of the two modes of distribution. There is little doubt that distribution by cassette or systems where students record off-air onto cassette are educationally more effective since students can reply, as well as stop and start, the cassettes at will. The costs of computer-based systems have been insufficiently studied to date, but the experience of the Open University, which has some 75,000 students taking degree-level courses, has been that the cost of providing each student with a personal compute 4R is such that the institution itself cannot hope to fund the project. Even if the university restricted itself to providing computers to students taking courses where a significant level of computing is deemed to be academically essential, it would quickly have to provide for the needs of at least 13,000 students. A machine which meets the needs of the university, basically MS-DOS operating system, 512K memory and VT100 communications capability, cost in the region of $900 $1,000 at 1981 prices, so the university cannot afford to equip students with personal computers. In view of this, the university has recently instituted a policy under which it hopes that students will either buy the machines outright at a negotiated rate of discount, with or without a bank loan, or hire them from the university at a rate which still makes student purchase an attractive option for those students who can foresee the need to have a machine for several years. The problem of student variable costs. Another factor which affects the costs of distance education systems is the extent to which students are provided with access to support systems. The cheapest form of distance education is found in those systems which register students for an examination, provide them with details of the syllabus and a list of books which will help them, and leave them to prepare themselves. This approach is that used by the University of London external degree system. With the exception of those taking the economics degree, students who wish to receive tuition have to enroll with a commercial correspondence college which provides them with lecture notes, set assignments, and arranges for these to be marked and commented on by a tutor. When students are ready, they present themselves for the examination. The cost of tuition is paid by the student. On the other hand, many of the new wave of distance teaching universities founded in the 1970s and 1980s in the wake of the British Open University have developed a sophisticated system based not only on the provision of educational course materials but also of student support services including counseling, correspondence tuition and face-to-face tuition. Rumble and Harry, 1982. The cost of tuition and counseling is either a direct, variable, student cost or a semi-variable cost related to the number of students taken on by tutors and counselors. Clearly, the provision of such services represents a reversion to the labor-intensive methods found in traditional education. The higher the direct variable or semi-variable cost per student, the nearer the teaching cost of distance education will approach that of traditional forms of education. Thus, for example, one of the Open University's early geography courses had a direct variable cost per student that was much higher than the variable cost of social science courses in traditional British universities, thus preventing the Open University from reaping any of the economics of scale said to be present in distance education, at least on this course. Laidlaw and Laird, 1974. Obviously, as the amount of face-to-face tuition provided increases, so a basic characteristic of distance teaching, the physical separation between the teacher and the learner, is lost. Ultimately, the situation occurs in which conventional classroom-based teaching, whether provided by regular teachers or by semi-trained animators, is being supported by centrally produced materials. There are or have been numerous systems of this kind, particularly at primary and secondary level. For example, the Radio Mathematics Project in Nicaragua, the Mauritius College of the Air, the El Salvador Educational Television Project, Telescandaria in Mexico, etc. Schemes of this kind may have a lower cost per student because the additional cost per student of developing, producing and distributing the centrally produced materials is more than offset by reductions in cost arising from the use of semi-trained animators. However, they are not distance education systems. The cost of the curriculum. A further factor which influences the cost of the curriculum, the costs of distance education, is the number of courses which the institution offers. Each course represents an investment in course materials. The more courses on offer, the greater the total investment and the greater the cost of maintaining them, or eventually replacing them with new versions or with entirely different courses. The number of courses is determined to some extent by the number of subject areas to be covered. The extent to which students pursue a single subject in depth, for example a specialized single subject degree course, or a combination of subjects, and the extent to which a range of optional courses is provided. The most efficient distance education system will be one with a relatively small range of courses and large numbers of students. The distance teaching program of the Universidad Pedagógica Nacional in Mexico is a good example. Dedicated to the in-service training of primary and secondary school teachers. The range of courses offered by the university is relatively limited and the numbers of students, 60,000 in 1980, substantial, thus ensuring that each course has a large number of students. As more courses are added to the curriculum, so the number of students per course will decline provided the total number of students remains constant or does no increase prorate to the increase in course options. For example, the British Open University was established in 1971. From the start it was assumed that it would grow quickly in size. In its first year it took in 25,000 students, registered on 4 courses. But by its second year, with course numbers increasing rapidly and student numbers still climbing, Laidlaw and Laird, 1974, were already able to foresee that the case for developing higher-level courses with relatively small number of students would have to be justified on the grounds that they are an integral part of a system providing wider access to complete degree courses rather than that they are a cheap way of doing this. By 1976 Wagner, 1977, could point out that the economies of scale reaped by the Open University had been achieved in its first years of operation, since when it has been following the conventional university pattern of little increase in productivity. Wagner argues that the major reason why this was so that the university had been using the economies of scale produced by rising student numbers to increase the overall numbers of courses offered to students. However, there were limits to the extent that the Open University could justify increases in its course offerings at the expense of economies of scale. Early in its development, the university prepared an academic plan which aimed at presenting an undergraduate academic profile equivalent to 111 credits, each credit equivalent to about 420 to 450 hours of student work. It quickly became apparent that it could not develop and support this load within existing or likely resource levels, and accordingly a more modest plan for the presentation of 87 credits was approved. This plan, with minor modifications, still forms the basis for the Open University's first degree is a general degree. And that students will not be able to specialize in a particular subject area. Moreover, it is recognized that further expansion of the profile of courses will have to be accomplished through the development of inexpensive courses or be accompanied by an increase in student numbers. One way of minimizing the costs of a profile is to extend the life of a course so that the costs of development can be written off over more years. Again, the experience of the Open University is instructive. Originally it planned to replace its courses every 4 years. It rapidly became obvious that it could not both sustain this aim and increase the number of courses on offer to students. Courses now routinely have to last for from 8 to 10 years, with all the implications this has for credibility as course content becomes dated. It is only fair to say that the university is very conscious of this problem. Commercial correspondence colleges have solved these problems by only presenting courses with comparatively low development and production costs. Concentration on courses that will not rapidly become outdated, and resolutely not developing courses which will attract relatively few students over their life. The new videotape lecture systems such as that developed by National Technological University in the United States has solved the problem of presenting state-of-the-art material which dates rapidly by videotaping lectures given in conventional universities, but the videos fall far short of the standards of self-instructional teaching material adopted by the best distance education systems. Absolute costs, average costs, efficiency and effectiveness. The many examples given above show not only how difficult it is to cost distance education in the abstract, but also how the costs of particular systems can be affected by management decisions. For this reason, relatively few costs have been cited in this article. The absolute cost of a system can be very high. On the other hand, the cost per student can be brought down below that found in traditional systems operating at the same educational level. Whether this happens may well depend upon the number of students attracted into the system. The chances of the Venezuelan Universidad Nacional Abierta reducing its average costs to a level where it could achieve its planners' aim that it should bring down the annual cost per student and reduce the social cost per graduate was threatened by the disastrously high dropout rates it experienced in its early years. Only 22.6% of the 1978 intake passed the introductory course, and the fact that the number of students attracted into the university actually fell between 1978 and 1981 while course offerings increased. Sequeira and Lynch. 1986. With an annual enrollment of about 4,400, the costs per course enrollment at Athabasca University were comparable with those found in conventional Albertan universities, while in 1972 the average cost per student at the more capital-intensive British Open University was found to equal that in conventional British universities when the university had 21,700 students. Laidlaw and Laird, 1974. At the time of this study, it already had over 31,000 students. Most economic studies measure the relative cost efficiency of distance and traditional educational systems. Efficiency is considered with the cost of achieving outputs. An organization is efficient relative to another enterprise if its outputs cost less per unit than that of the other institution. It becomes more efficient to the extent that it maintains outputs with a less than proportionate increase in inputs. The fact that a distance education institution has a low cost per student, credit hour or graduate does not necessarily mean that the institution is as efficient as it could be. It may well be able to reduce its unit costs by increasing its internal efficiency through changes in practice and cost reductions. As Mace, 1978, commented in respect of the British Open University. Generally, in making a comparison, it is assumed that the quality of the output of systems operating at the same educational level is comparable. This is not always the case. There is, however, some concrete evidence that the level of comprehension of students completing traditionally taught economics courses Heriot-Watt University in the United Kingdom and those completing distance-taught economics courses at the Open University was similar. Lumsden and Scott. 1982. More generally, however, planners will be disappointed at the amount of evidence available. Aicha et al., 1982. Since what there is suggests that motivated students can learn from any medium provided it is competently used and adapted to their needs. Aicha et al., 1982, Wells, 1976. Who should pay? The costs of any distance education project may be met by a number of agencies. Broadly speaking, the possibilities are government, international aid agencies, employers and students. In considering who should meet the costs, a distinction is sometimes made between projects that aim to reach students in the normal school-age population and those aimed at post-secondary or adult populations. It is often argued that the costs of adult education should not fall on government. The reasons for this include a. Adherence to a front-loaded model of education which undervalues adult education, and hence believes that it is not something that should be paid for by government. B. The belief that non-vocational adult education is essentially a private affair, of benefit to the individual, and that therefore the individual should pay for it. C. The belief that the costs of vocational and professional education should be met either by the individual or his or her employer, and D. Concern at the open-ended nature of the commitment to continuous education that is implicit in the extension of state to adult education. There is, however, another perspective that argues that the education of adults is not a luxury. That increased technological and social change leading to the obsolescence of knowledge acquired during the initial period of education and training requires continuing investment in the retraining and re-education of individuals, and that this is not just something which the individual or employer should pay for, since the capacity of individuals and employers to pay for it is limited, but also a responsibility of government. Many governments are aware of the need to retain large number of people in areas of national skill shortages. But they have been much more reluctant to acknowledge a responsibility for the development of adult and continuing education in non-vocational subjects and areas where there are no skill shortages. The question, who pays, is thus linked to the question, what is being taught? It is clear that large employers are seriously concerned about skills shortages and the need for retraining. Several large companies have set up in-house distance and open education programs to meet the needs of dispersed workforces. The State University of California, CACO, has set up a satellite-delivered videotape and tutored video instruction system to meet the needs of engineers working for Hewlett-Packard. Small firms, however, cannot afford to invest in the development of distance teaching systems. Individuals, while they may be willing to invest some personal resources in their further education, have to do so within the level of discretionary income which they have available, that is, the income they have left over after they have paid for the basic necessities of life for themselves and their families. What constitutes discretionary income will be determined by income levels, personal expectations about what is a necessity, and the cost of these. It is clearly important that those setting up a distance education system should know what the discretionary income of the target student population in order that judgments can be made about students' potential ability to pay fees and meet the costs of studying. In a commercial correspondence college, the fee per student per course, Y, will need to cover a. The direct, student variable, cost of teaching, 2. B. The direct costs of presenting the courses, Px, C. The development and production costs of the courses, Cs, annualized over the life of the courses, L, and uplifted by projected rates of inflation in order to generate the capital required for investment in the replacement course, and D. The fixed costs of the enterprise, including as allowance for the replacement of capital, F. The more student courses, S, there are in the system, the lower the fee can be. Y equals K PR, C8 per liter, F upon S. A commercial correspondence college may also wish to generate a profit. The institution will need grants from government or other sources to the extent that student fees do not meet total costs. Not surprisingly, commercial correspondence colleges have restricted themselves to course lines which do not need constant updating and which will attract high volumes of students. There is always the danger that the number of students attracted to the program will be insufficient to generate sufficient funds to replace the stock of courses and the other capital tied up in the British Open Tech project. When the government's pump priming funds came to an end, the projects had to become self-sufficient. Relatively few of them had enough students to be able to make this change. One other aspect of costs needs to be mentioned here, and this is the cost to students of equipping themselves to study. Depending on the media choice made by the institution, students need to have access to a range of equipment in order to study. In some cases, personal ownership of the equipment is already widespread among the population at large, and it may be reasonable to expect all students to supply their own equipment, radios. In other cases, television sets, audio cassette players, video cassette players, personal computers, student ownership will depend in part on the market penetration of the equipment among households. Given the society in question, or the extent to which it is reasonable to expect students to equip themselves out of their discretionary income. Among other factors which may come into play is the extent to which the piece of equipment is required on a number of courses, or will only be used on 1 or 2 courses. In the latter case, or where it is clear that students will be unable to afford the equipment themselves, then the institution may have to provide it for students. It is very important that in deciding what media to use, the cost to the student of the particular choice is evaluated against the student's ability to meet it. It is clear that the introduction of new technologies can change the cost structure of distance education and also the balance between the extent to which the institution or the student is expected to meet the cost. Distance education is seen as a means of lowering the cost per student and hence of reaching more students. It will be particularly ironic if, through the adoption of new information technologies based on the computer and advanced telecommunications, students should have to bear an increased proportion of the costs of learning, for, as the cost to the student rises, so it becomes more likely that only the better off will be able to afford access to distance courses without government and employers' help. If help is not forthcoming, then, advanced technology, distance education will become yet another service restricted only to those whose discretionary income is large enough to meet the cost. The disadvantaged, the unemployed and the low-paid will lose out. Though low-cost, traditional correspondence-based systems, based on print and correspondence tuition with some use of audio, may continue to serve their needs. In third-world countries, this latter form of distance education may be the only kind that can be provided, given the cost involved in setting up and running the more expensive high-tech forms of distance education. This article has shown why, given the differences in the structure of costs between distance and traditional education systems, the former can be cheaper per student, credit hour of graduate than the latter. Distance education can be as good as traditional forms of education, in terms of the quality of what is learned. Whether distance education is actually cheaper depends on a number of factors, including choice of media, the number of subject areas cost is kept below the level found in traditional forms of education, and, of course, the number of students. It has also shown the issue of who pays, student, employer, or government, is an important one which has a bearing on both what is taught and access, and it has suggested that, as new technologies develop, so the technologization of distance education will put increasing costs onto students, with further implications for access. Third world countries, it is suggested, may be unable to exploit the new, high-tech, forms of distance education now being developed in the advanced industrialized countries. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next video with the next chapter.